I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. And joining us now for this discussion is Dr. Monique Bedasse, who is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches courses in African history, Caribbean history, and Africana studies. She is also a fellow graduate of the legendary Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, but joins us now specifically to talk with us about her latest book, Jah Kingdom, Rastafarians, Tanzania, and Pan-Africanism in the Age of Decolonization, a new book freshly out on the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Bedasse, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start with, I told you before we were going to get started that I wanted to start with something admittedly kind of trifling in a pop cultural sense. You know, both of us we teach, we're on campuses a lot, and invariably it seems that without end, generation after generation, every semester we get the kind of a reoccurrence of the dorm room poster selection variation or t-shirt selection, or we get students coming on campus, and a lot of them to this day like to wear or make reference in some form or fashion to Bob Marley, often, you know, almost exclusively, unfortunately, in the context of just smoking weed, or at least just basically, you know, with his more popular forms of music. But so I wanted to start with that and have you maybe talk a little bit about Bob Marley and how he figures into your book and into your story, and where you're trying to take us with this discussion of Rastafarianism, because you actually write at one point, you talk about, in fact, you say here, the highly recognizable Rasta iconography has long been associated with the process by which the once marginal movement transitioned into the mainstream, as well as the ways in which the international consumers of such iconography have adapted Rastafari to different local circumstances. Jah Kingdom instead emphasizes an interior history of Rastafari that sees its evolution from within and not from the perspectives of those who have adapted the movement's cultural symbols to different local circumstances. So when I read that, I thought immediately of just this college experience and students and this cultural adaptation or appropriation of Bob Marley and these symbols without the kind of depth that you bring to it in this book. So with that long sort of, again, trifling beginning, could you use that to bring us into the depth and substance that is in your book?
Okay, so it's not trifling. I think most people will enter Rastafari through such a reference, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important part of the history, you know, how Rastafari, its international growth through the prism of culture. And Bob Marley appears in the book in chapter 3 briefly in terms of his relationship with former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley. Mm-hmm. But, you know, my book is actually trying to take readers away from that interpretation of Rastafari's international growth, right? So I think I would say the most fundamental conceptual leap I'm asking readers to make is to think of Rastafari's international growth less in terms of its transmission through culture, so reggae music, art, etc., and more in terms of the movement of Rasta people, and specifically repatriation, and for my book, repatriation to Tanzania in the post-independence period. And when we make that shift, then it opens us up to not only the history of how Rastafarians translated their dream of repatriation into a lived reality, but also their continued, ever evolving, but continued connection to Pan-African politics and praxis, right? You know, ideas and practice of Pan-Africanism.
So sort of continuing with that segue of sorts, you write also that the movement, that is the Rastafari movement, has fallen prey to reductionist and sanitized narratives that strip oppositional movements of their radicalism. Rastafari's dynamic and ever poignant critiques of racism and capitalism throughout the 1970s and beyond have been concealed by the focus on Rastafari as popular culture. the movement has been subjected to the same hegemonic structures that have frozen Martin Luther King Jr. in his I Have a Dream speech, extracted only one love from Bob Marley, and converted Nelson Mandela, the freedom fighter, into Mandela, the lovable voice of reconciliation. So if we could just maybe start from there, and or continue on from there rather, and talk a little bit about some of the things I wanted to specifically ask you about. That is, how does, for instance, Rastafari define Pan-Africanism in the the context of variations of Pan-African definitions?
Right.
And then specifically, as you talk about where does Tanzania and its particular relationship to Pan-African historical struggle and beyond fit into this discussion?
Okay, how did I know that you would pick that passage out? I knew it. Okay, so yeah, I think so as a historian of Africa and the Caribbean, right? I'm always struck by, and of Pan-Africanism, I'm always struck by how we remember certain figures, right? So when we think of Mandela, and I think of Mandela being basically a terrorist in the 60s, how we would define a terrorist now, right? And now all of a sudden he was, I've heard a colleague say a sort of Santa Clausification of Mandela, right?
And in fact, he was on the terrorist watch list up until shortly before his death, if I'm not mistaken, like even well into his post-apartheid career.
The juxtaposition, right, of, what he represented to the Western world, in the 60s compared to what he became in the 90s and beyond, right? It's just like a fascinating thing to observe. So I think about Rasta in reference to all of those college posters and everything else that you see, right? I think when we focus on culture as the only, I'm not saying culture can't do political work at all, but I think it's a very, very different history if we look, for example, through the prism of Pan-Africanism, right? And we think about Rasta in terms of repatriation. Not only do we get a story of this relationship between Africa and its diaspora, right? But we do not lose sight of the fact that in the post-independence period, right, there's a shift across Africa and the Caribbean, in that there's a shift from colonial rule to independent states. And what we have are independent states led by Black people, right? And that is a very generative and hopeful, heady moment for Black people, right? Because on one hand, it allows for greater Pan-African mobilization. And this is where states like Ghana, under Nkrumah, and Tanzania under Nyerere step in, right? And become this impetus for diasporic mobilization, right? And so through this repatriation, we are able to really focus on not just the fact that Rastafarians put the case to Nyerere, saying, okay, you are a Pan-Africanist, Africa is home. We think of ourselves, our primary identity is African and not Jamaican. Our identity cannot never come in a diasporic, or freedom can never come in a diasporic space, right? And so we focus on what does it mean that Rastas have always thought about, theorized about African liberation. When they're in Africa, close to the action, Tanzania becomes this mecca of Pan-African activity, right? And members of all of the liberation movements of Southern Africa are stationed there. So they're able to act on these ideas that they'd had for decades, right? What does it mean that they've always had a critique of capitalism? And how does that translate into this period when we have Black governments that begin to suppress radical Black activists within their borders, right? How do those ideas about race, which of course we know that nationalism does not in any way solve the problems of Black people globally, right? So while it opens up these new opportunities, it also points out the divisions, right, even more. Class or the fact that these politicians become these elites, right? So what does that mean in terms of the evolution of Pan-Africanism? And I'm arguing that through the repatriation, right, we're able to take Rastafari's politics very seriously. What does it mean that they've always tried to champion a life of communalism, that socialism, even communism, has been associated with Rasta for a very long time? What does it mean that they Nyerere's policy of Ujamaa, African socialism, was able to resonate with Rastafarians in a profound way. So Pan-Africanism for Rastafarians in a very basic way, meant that they were of African descent, all African people were connected, right? And that in terms of repatriation, they were committed to a global struggle for liberation of all African people, right? And so repatriation was not just about this dream to escape Babylon, so to speak, right? But it was about their participation also in this wider Pan-African struggle for liberation. And as a result of that, the repatriation also yields this history of how Rasta is connected, has been connected, and was certainly connected in this period to a wide Pan-African network of scholars, politicians, lay people, activists, and others.
Let's go. Let's get busy. The full citation is in the show description. If you want to look it up. I haven't gone back to this article in a long time, but the reread, I mean, it is so okay. Babylon's Natural Mystic, the North American music industry, the legend of Bob Marley, and the incorporation of transnationalism. And I'm forgetting the exact date. I thought it was on the page. It's there it is, 1998, Cultural Studies, 1998. And essentially, well, we're just going to go through at least a good portion of it. But essentially what she's saying is the radicalism, what she describes as Black transnationalism, the Pan-Africanism, the radical Blackness of Bob Marley in the hands of white liberal corporate commercialism has been reduced to the singular individual man, reducing the concept of the one, or rather, reducing the concept of the struggle and of Bob Marley to the singular man, and the concept of struggle to a singular person, this heroic individual. But in an odd way, attempts to universalize the specifically radical blackness and Pan-Africanness of Bob Marley's message, so that white liberals can feel better and a part of a symbolic, empty struggle that can occur without actual struggle, a change that can occur without actual struggle. So she hits all the notes that we see already in that preview. And we have to note again that this dude is now, like his whole career is being turned into to playing horrific renditions of superheroes. Malcolm X, now Bob Marley. I don't know what's coming next. But the goal, as Stephen says here, is to make him more palatable to white liberal audience in America. Marley's revival as an object of consumer desire for the 1990s reflects market-driven considerations such as the lucrative cataloging business of reissuing the work of dead rock stars. So we can't stop that. You're better off, you're worth more dead than alive. So she starts talking about the 1984 Legend collection, which many in my generation were through which many in my generation were introduced to Bob Marley. And I need to have these pictures up, at least ready, because they come back. So I just want to show, because as she'll describe, and we'll talk a little bit about the pictures. So even if you want to start to pull them up on your own as you watch this, just to have, they become relevant here. The way he's pictured, and then the song selection, etc., we'll come back to momentarily in a minute. Bob Marley carries such cultural and commercial weight in North America because he embodies Black transnational cultural production in the late 20th century. Marley's life and career, his legend, as it were, reflects the two main features of contemporary transnationalism: the growth of international capital and the rise of the multinational corporation, particularly in the mass media industries in the era of postmodernism and late capitalism, and the increased back and forth migration of third world citizens between core and periphery, first and third world since decolonization. Oh, whoops. Oh man, I really wish. Maybe I'll try to reach out to her again. But we had done a couple of interviews years ago when I first found this work, and man, was she right on. Is she? She still is. One of Marley's 1970s contemporaries, the group Parliament Funkadelic, ceaselessly waged a battle with North American record labels on precisely these grounds. The band demonstrated their contempt for the industry by signing competing record conglomerates under a variety of different names. This idea of wanting to maintain control over their work. In a recent interview, George Clinton stated, "My main thing is I don't want to happen to us what happened to James Brown, Bob Marley, and Jimi Hendrix. Somebody else owns their music." But Bob Marley's construction as the natural mystic in the 1990s, in 1990s American culture reflects not only the incorporation of his music, but also the incorporation of his image and message. Here I use the term incorporation both literally and figuratively to refer to the increased corporate control over and commercialization of Marley's work, and to the specific way in which this has been accomplished symbolically. And I really like what she does here with this. In Webster's dictionary, the term incorporate can have three possible meanings. First and foremost, to incorporate, to mean to unite with one another body, forming a new unit, as in business. Here, the term refers to the financial activities of corporate mergers and conglomerations. Similarly, Marley's financial estate has been the source of much wrangling over the anyway. So that's one. I don't really. Yeah, anyway, first and foremost, to incorporate as in a business. The second, as she points out, is I just lost it. I see the third. What happened to the second? Oh, cultural capital. Sorry. So in addition, however, Marley's cultural capital in North America has increased the more incorporate without body or material substance he has become. So the more he's established and used for cultural capital in North America, the more incorporate, I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right, but the more out of body he becomes. Without body, he becomes. The figure of the natural mystic is a deliberately ethereal icon, one removed from the very social and political context of reggae production in the 1970s. A third meaning of incorporation is to be united in one body. Marley's incorporation into North American popular culture has depended on the fetishization of his black body. Marley offers an image of blackness that has helped to preserve a North American identity built on the integration of racial differences into one unified national body politic. And already we see that in this preview, in the trailer. One man, one movement, one love. Not in a context of Pan-African unity. And as we're going to get to, this is that is so slick. It's called One Love because it's set in the 1978 One Love peace concert that they're talking about, where he's there and famously unites the two, holds the hands up of the two competing ruling party, Manly and I keep forgetting the other guy's name, but they're But a year later or 2 years later, Marley is in Zimbabwe celebrating Zimbabwean independence. Oh my God. So by choosing that
by choosing 78, he's already been distorted in that context, but by choosing 78 and not 80, they're already setting us up. This whole, and then this whole oneness, and the whole, and the, oh man, it's woo. And then this whole thing that I've been ever since, and it really didn't hit home for me until Fruitvale Station. But this whole thing about having to humanize these Black people, because the baseline in a colony, the baseline of white supremacy, the baseline when you reduce people to commodity is not to see them as human beings. So that's why white people constantly need this humanization project before they can even deign to spend time indirectly with Black cultural production. Never mind people themselves. I mean, it's so, anyway. The Marley of the 1970s, rude boy, revolutionary Rastafari, needed to be exercised for the singer to appeal to a more mainstream white audience. So she goes through this. She talks about 3 stages. That this occurred in. The 1970s moment of post-colonial revolutionary nationalism in the Caribbean, concomitant with the increased migration of West Indians to the United States post-1965 and their initial impact on both Black and white American society and culture. The incorporation of these immigrants and their American-born children into newly imagined multicultural American family throughout the 1980s. The transnational moment of the 1990s that situates multicultural America and multinational capital in a global circuit of cultural exchange and labor migration. Bob Marley's shifting meanings in American culture during these 3 periods was captured in 4 cultural documents. The 1972 film, The Harder They Come, which I would not have thought of because I always understood Jimmy Cliff, who I love, to have been a precursor to Bob Marley and also not a Rasta. I thought Jimmy is a Christian. So I would not have known to make that association. And then, but where I did know, and this is where I definitely, become aware of the story, is the 2 CD compilations, Legend in 1984 and The Natural Mystic 1985, and then the 4 CD box set, Songs of Freedom in 1992. Together, these 4 texts stand as an evolving story of the new West Indian immigrants to America since the post-1965 immigration wave. And then she talks a little bit about Norman Mailer and the white fantasy with the Black outlaw and Black masculinity. She talks about Paul Gilroy and his classic work and this need to separate the product from its producers, the gradual involvement of large corporations with a broad base in leisure industries and the selling of reggae stimulated important changes reflecting a conscious attempt to separate the product from its producers and from its roots in Black life. Boy, that sounds familiar in this 50th anniversary of hip hop. Boy, that process. Ooh, jazz, oh, we haven't seen that before. Oh, rock, we haven't seen that before. Oh, everything. And then look at the stories coming out now about hip hop not selling anymore, Black rappers not getting deals anymore, these same companies move into Afrobeat and Latin America. Oh boy. Oh boy. And look at what Gilroy says here. Cinemas showing the film The Harder They Come became artificially insulated spaces in which images of Black life, in this case, is backward, violent, sexist, and fratricidal, could be consumed. That movie theater, it's a monster. As Charles Shaw Murray wrote, has described it, the Black body and performance bears the accumulated weight of the fantasies and mythologies constructed around Black music and Black people by whites. When Jay Cox in 1992 reviewed Bob Marley's Songs of Freedom box set as one of the most magical and darkly lyrical stories in the whole mythology of contemporary music, he invoked this complex of magic, race, and sexuality. The incorporation of the Rastafarian Rude Boy came to an abrupt end with both the close of the 1970s and the death of Marley at the turn of the decade in 1981. However, Island Records soon began the process of exhuming the superstar's image with the release of the Legend compilation in 1984, 3 years after Marley's death. Chris Blackwell, the Jamaican white producer, who owned Island Records and made Marley internationally famous in the 1970s, admitted to a certain queasiness at the speed of Marley's resurrection. I wasn't terribly keen on putting together a best of Bob. We didn't put anything together after he died. In 1984, Dave Robinson was running the company. He thought we should do it. I said I didn't really want to get involved in it, and he said he would do it himself. But a very different structure of popular feeling in the 1980s required a very different Marley. The slogans of multiculturalism and one love were replacing those of get up, stand up from the 1960s and 1970s, when Jamaican national independence and black power signified self-determination, liberation in both the Caribbean and the United States. See, that whole thing, they hadn't completed the rebrand of black power yet. But this was all part of the wrapping that up, and so they got to get rid of it, get up, stand up, at least diminish it as much as possible by in my estimation sort of putting it submersing it beneath a wave of other Marley songs. He had so many. But wow. Anyway. Chris Blackwell continued, Dave Robinson approached the whole thing very professionally and very well. He even did some market research on it, finding out what the general public in England thought about reggae. Not the sort of thing I would have done. I was too close to it, I think. Research and corporate objectivity in the figure of Dave Robinson produced the final concept on which Marley's legend for the future would be based. Though through all that research, he finally came up with what the album cover and title should be. He learned that you should keep the word reggae out of it. Reggae had a mixed reaction. Some people liked reggae, some people hated it. A lot of people didn't like about Bob Marley what was the threatening aspect of him, the revolutionary side. So the picture was chosen. So the picture chosen was one of the softest pictures of Bob. It was a very well-conceived and thought-out package and a very well-put-together record. It's an undeniable success. It was #1 in Britain for months, and it was the top 3 catalog records of all time. I thought this was fascinating because we heard the word reggae used in that preview. So my assumption would be, because I do agree with the argument largely made here, I'm just going to have to just jump out there and suggest that the reason reggae is safe now is because the broader process that Stevens is describing has been successful. So there's the word reggae is at this point safe, because remember, this is 1998 that this is published. But 1980, early 1980s when this decision was made, based on research among the white audience that was going to be the target for the sale of this package. Island's packaging of Marley and Legend erased the fact that the singer was the product of a subversive collective consciousness in Jamaica. By taking reggae and the revolutionary out of the conception of the album, Island's producers isolated all the music's meaning into the body of the individual artist himself. Hence, Marley is the body of reggae. And then we see it happen. We see that exactly happening in the preview already. Blackwell's comments on Legend demonstrated a certain use of personal history in Island's promotion of the Marley Legend. The story that seemed to have the most appeal for both the audiences and the producers in the 1980s stressed the softer picture of Marley over and above his more revolutionary side. The picture was reproduced in 1995 with the release of Natural Mystic. So this was the picture that they used on Legend. and then they reshot it and reissued it with this one, or vice versa. But as she explains in here, this is the same. It's the same shot from two different angles. So of all the pictures, they were going to use this one. And then she talks about the famous footage in as part of this repackaging in the video for One Love, where the video shoot was to be shaped around a children's party in which Bob played the part of a Rastafarian Pied Piper. This was a very different conception of Marley's ability to inspire an audience to take to the streets. The one thing, and I guess this would be something I would want to ask, and maybe some of you know, and I'll check the chat shortly when I finish, but I don't think it's explained here why Marley would have participated in this video shoot, because it's a signature changing point. So both were taken, as it says here, in a session from 1977. That is the cover for these Legend album. These cover photos for the Legend album in Kiskadee Center in North London during the video shoot, which was meant to be used for Marley's track "Is This Love." So I don't know if his understanding of why, and I have to go back or maybe find some of the literature where maybe he talks about it, or someone else explains it. He was there in 1977 to shoot this video for this song. And I think he's also at the time still recovering from both physically and psychologically from the shooting. I have to get that straight. But what ends up happening after his death, so whatever his reasons for being there, what happens after his death is that the pictures are taken and turned into something else. Where again, I love this point she makes here, the ability to inspire people to take to the streets is reduced to a multicultural children's party. The party was entirely contrived. The simple family snapshot of the Marleys would never have emerged while his record company was promoting him as a swaggering and sexually available Rastaman shrouded by a cloud of ganja smoke. Island producers confirmed that the video and photographs produced from the Kiskadee shoot in 1977 were never shown at the time, precisely because it was felt to conflict with the more militant image of Bob that was then being put forward. Rather, the true importance of the photographic session was not to be understood until years later, 1984 to be precise, when the Island Records art department was searching for a suitable cover shot for the Legend compilation LP. The Legend release drew from an untapped archive of images in order to humanize the performer and make him more accessible to an audience initially intimidated by the revolutionary aspects of the third world music in the 1970s. And then by 1995, one could say that Rita Marley's prophecy had come true. Like Christ, Marley had returned to the American popular imagination in a new name, the Natural Mystic. The Natural Mystic was the product of a concerted reinterpretation of the meaning of Marley's revolutionary internationalism. It represented the dismantling of the specifically racialized politics central to Marley's self-promotion as a transnational cultural producer. The artist as prophet was far removed from much purer than both Marley's image as the hedonistic Rastafarian heathen or Marley as the rude boy ghetto gangster. Instead, the newly incorporated National Mystic magically crossed over all national and racial boundaries with a pluralist vision of one love that legitimated the national narrative of multicultural America. And here we are getting it again. We're getting it again, literally in both title and what has to be. And we'll come back to the film. There's a couple other things about the making of the film that I forgot to get to now that I'm looking at my notes again, just quickly. Or did I make that point? I think I did make the point already. Did I? Anyway, the point is simply that the movie is coming out is produced by Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston's Plan B. I think I said this, right? Yeah. the 12 Years a Slave People, and then Tough Gong Republic Records, which is a Universal Music imprint, is the distribution of the music. Anyway. But it was the 1992 4-CD box set Songs of Freedom that provided the comprehensive history which took Marley from the revolutionary and sexual icon he was in the 1970s through the humanist and family man he became in the 1980s to the universal mystic of the 1990s. The function of the CD box set is not merely to present an artist's music, but also to produce the artist as the subject of music history. The boxed set boxes in the subject by telling its story and by locating its narratives at the intersections of recordings, biography, and history. Finally, the box set removes the artist from his or her own corporeal history so that they can transcend artistically and historical moment in order to become an important historical figure. Wow, that's fantastic. And I did just so people, because I know that there are some people who may not even know what a CD is at this point, much less have seen this box set. But I just want to just show a picture quickly of what the box set looked like. And I absolutely ordered it when it first came out. I was still in the Navy at the time, and it came in this big, sort of elongated case. And it had the CDs in it. And as Stevens talks about, each CD, starting with the first one, is matched with a booklet, which on top of which is the these pictures of Bob at various stages. And it's meant to say like you're getting him in all four of his stages, culminating in as we'll see. Well, I'll let her describe it in her words. I think it's better, but I just wanted to let folks just get a reminder at least of what those things looked like, if anyone needed one. And then she talks about here, because of the way it was produced, the way it was organized and distributed, it was considered, and the way it was priced, it was considered a high cultural product within the hierarchy of music industry. So it came with like this added authority. Beginning with the picture of a young, serious Marley, low afro, entitled Air, the portraits move through the Earth Marley of the early 1970s with the short locks reflecting his recent conversion to Rastafari, to a third entitled Fire, of an angry Marley in camouflage shirt and cap before a backdrop of flames, to the last entitled Water, of a fully dreadlocked and goatee Marley, wisely and wondrously pontificating before a backdrop of water. This elemental trajectory was also circular. Marley's water stage doused the fire of urban riots and ghetto revolutions so Marley could return to the air from which he came. You know what's coming off of that one. You gotta know what's coming off of that one, because goobly goop is that.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
This elemental trajectory was also circular. Marley's water stage doused the fire of urban riots and ghetto revolutions so Marley could return to the air from which he came. I even put notes, bars. The chronological bias of the set, beginning with Marley's... So, by the way, the chronological bias in this film is this 1978 setting specific around this concert, where the violence is going to be carefully couched as black on black. It's going to show Marley raising the hands of the two beige, at best, potential leaders as a sign of peace and one love and world humanity. And then he's going to die. And then everybody's going to say, see, Bob wouldn't talk about nothing. Let's go smoke some weed in an apolitical, unrevolutionary, unstudied context and keep it moving. Anyway, the chronological bias, as Stephen says, of the set, beginning with Marley's Rude Boy stage and culminating in his visionary moment of full Rastafari, must not be taken at face value. This was an ideologically motivated construction that served more functions than merely demonstrating the progressive historical importance of this musical figure. Rather, the chronological structure ultimately negated the historical importance of Marley's cultural and racial politics by emphasizing his spiritual transcendence. The implication behind the last stage in this progression is that Marley matured from his authentic representation of the Black and minority urban ghetto into a more universal visionary artist or leader. Man, and here we go. Marley's explicitly political concert in Zimbabwe, celebrating that country's independence from colonial rule, occurred only 1 year before his death. 2 years previously, in 1979, 2 songs from the Survival album, Ambush in the Night and Zimbabwe, were more than enough evidence that Marley openly supported Jamaican independence and favored the Black Democratic Socialist government led by Michael Manley's People's National Party. His performances in New Zealand and Australia left their traces in his wake, inspiring Maori and Aboriginal audiences to political consciousness. The producers of the set would have us believe that the producers of this legend set would have us believe that Marley's central concern in his dying moments was a transcendent desire for universal peace and harmony, unconnected to these specific contemporaneous political and historical events. Tell me we didn't see that in these previews.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
Seriously. And I listened to the Survival album up and back to work today, and I mean, no disrespect to Bob, but I forgot how dope it is and how radical that album is. And this is what Stevens was talking about. And yet we don't get this concert. This isn't the central concert, the theme. We get one starting the year before, and even that's going to probably be misrepresented. Reviews of the set, however, emphasize the industry's version of Marley's universalism by frequently mentioning his lack of popularity among Black audiences in the United States during the 1970s. Gilroy's and Murray's argument that the central thrust of the 20th century American popular music is the need to separate Black music, which by and large white Americans love, from Black people who by and large they don't. White Americans loved him all the more for it, and reggae became something that the white hippoisie considered the Black American masses too bourgeois to appreciate. However, there is much evidence to suggest that Marley made explicit efforts towards the end of his life to counter the industry's marketing strategy and appeal to African Americans. Marley's last scheduled tour, which was canceled when he went to hospital, was covered by all the major Black publications in America for the first time in his career. The box set blurb on the song Africa Unite also notes that on the Survival tour, Bob Marley and the Wailers consciously opened their U.S. dates at the legendary Apollo in Harlem. Longstanding residents of Harlem claim that the area had not buzzed like that since Marcus Garvey's time there. That's a deep link. You think that'll get referenced in the film? His incorporation of bluesy guitar playing and disco rhythms can be interpreted not as as obvious concessions to the demands of white rock audience, but as attempts to utilize the very elements most likely to appeal to the Black audiences of North America. His growing awareness of the racial politics of his cultural production contradicts and complicates reviewers and music historians' assessment of Marley's final stage as that of the universalist who had transcended the racial allegiances necessary in his own particular historical and political moment. And didn't we just see that in the preview? Didn't we just see that in the preview? Again, the universal in replacement. There's no reference to Pan-Africanism or blackness in there. There's just peace and one love. The reception of the 1992 Songs of Freedom box set revealed how North American music critics have organized black music history more generally to exclude the political and social history of black musical production in the United States and the ways this history shaped Marley's work. And again, I mean, that rings so loudly as I've been going back and reviewing and looking at all this 50th hip hop history, celebratory madness. And yes, I've seen the England piece. Everybody keeps sending me the England piece. And I keep saying, with all due respect, he can write. And I've seen his stuff, I think, in the Chronicle of Higher Education too. But it just reads like transcripts of my show. It's bars. I agree with almost everything I think he was saying in it. But this is what she's talking about. North American music critics have organized black music history more generally to exclude the political and social history of black musical production. In their presentation of the softer, gentler Marley, reviewers constructed a false dichotomy between the purported black soul music of the late 60s and early 70s, nostalgically remembered as embodying the high integrationist ideals of the civil rights era in Songs of Freedom, as opposed to the more militant values of the late 1960s and early 1970s as expressed in the chants and raps for Black Power. In this context, when reviewers promoted Marley's Songs of Freedom as the last great soul music, the memory of a time when music could be soulful, political, brutally honest, never divisive, and could still keep the beat. The emphasis here was less on Marley's political and social commentary and more on his ability to fulfill the dreams and ideals of racial harmony that in the white liberal imagination have been betrayed. So I love what she does here too by reminding us that this one nation under a groove was not just a romantic belief that music and power can unite humanity. And for Murray, this is the fallacy of multiculturalism, one of the great liberal myths that people can live together in harmony once they have learned to eat each other's food and dance to each other's music. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I fully agree. And they reduce this issue of one nation to a facile internationalism, global peace without revolutionary struggle, to imagine in actuality national unity. This national myth obscured the specifically black transnational history of Pan-Africanism to which the actual Parliament Funkadelic track from 1978, One Nation Under a Groove, obliquely referred. That diasporic vision of black national independence. It's not one nation as in one United States. It's in one universal black nation. Due to the repressive actions of the state against the increasing militancy of the Black Power movement, clear, open statements were replaced in musical culture, at least by more oblique forms of signification. Furthermore, the dream of life beyond the reach of racism acquired an otherworldly utopian quality and then manifested itself in a flash high-tech form deliberately remote from the everyday realities of the ghetto life world. That's why we saw Parliament and the spaceship and all that, and Earth, Wind, and Fire and all the and everybody was in some wild get up. Sun Ra, even all of them. And then she talks about the shift resulting in Sly and the Family Stone and that form of the music. I mean, but specific to this problem here. If we examine Marley's musical production in the context of the political climate in the United States during the 1970s, his own foregrounding of the mystical becomes a part of his general strategy to follow the shift in black music to mystical Pan-Africanism and thereby appeal to a black American audience rather than a natural, steady progression towards mystic universalism for its own sake. The North American music industry favors the myth that the crossover appeal of black music depends upon a universalist vision of racial harmony rather than a protest against the racially specific conditions of the oppressed minorities of the nation. This first allows for the salvation of the nation through unification. One nation under the groove. The other threatens its dismantling. The separation of Marley's music from black people is structurally necessary to the cultural politics of the United States because it's the only way in which racial harmony can be imagined. Man, you know what time it is.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
That is bars. The North American music industry favors the myth that the crossover appeal of black music depends upon a universalist vision of racial harmony rather than a protest against the racially specific conditions of the oppressed minorities of the nation. The first allows for the salvation of the nation through unification. One nation under a groove, the other threatens its dismantling. Salvation of the nation through unification, and they talking about some dismantling. And then as she says here, the fetishization of Marley removes Marley from his community by focusing on the artist as an autonomous individual. We got it in big letters in that opening preview. Big print. One man. Oh, she does this whole dope thing, talk about the setting for this picture. They love this Bob Dylan-esque Bob by himself with an acoustic guitar playing a medley of Guava Jelly and Stir It Up. And they highlight this to further disassociate him. And then as she starts to wrap up, corpses, corpuses, and corporations. The recent revival of Marley has been precisely an attempt to reverse his political positioning along the musical spectrum. This can only be understood in the context of what has happened within black music since the 1980s, with the rise of the politically dangerous performers such as Public Enemy and NWA, who threatened to dismantle the liberal myth that the cultural function of black music is to promote racial harmony. Marley is now being canonized as a safer version of black musical protest as opposed to those rappers who represent the betrayal of the dream of the universalized, unaffiliated black performer. Hence the insistent efforts on the part of the producers of the box set to disassociate Marley's revolutionary lyrics from any stigmatic affiliation with the present day similar musical productions. So check this out though. Has not what she is describing happening to Bob Marley's image in his death held up in juxtaposition to the rise at the time of Public Enemy and NWA and what people thought that meant? It happening to Public Enemy and NWA in their lifetime with their complicity and great reward? This is the point I've been making about the 50th anniversary. There was this moment even as late as the late 90s, apparently, where it was thought that in the 80s, Public Enemy and NWA represented a potentially politically dangerous dismantling of liberal mythology. Now they are the performers, the grand spokespeople, representers of the liberal mythology. Damn. This return of Marley in this image legitimizes the industry construction of Marley as the natural mystic. Marley refused to leave a will. I don't get that. So So that's just more about the legal beef. The conscious effort to revitalize Marley has as much to do with the present as it does the past. That is absolutely right. We got to understand it that way. What they're about to drop on us next year is meant to speak to us today. That has always been my point. I love that, and I probably got it from her. That is always the point with these quote unquote historical biopics and references to, history, et cetera, and so forth, and moments in history and time periods and movements and people, is to tell those stories in a way that will have an impact on people potentially threatening today.